Do we remember where sin or debt began in Scripture? Well, we'd have to go back to the book of Genesis in the beginning, when man was placed in the garden. Of course, we know he was given the command that he was to not, he could not, he was told, you cannot eat. Okay, it was a command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Only one tree did not belong to him, wasn't his property, wasn't to touch it. So therefore, he knew the consequence, which was death. That was the penalty. So we know that everything that operates in sin and debt is death. The dead, the body corporate, which is how we operate legal society today. So now we'll go into Genesis when God basically had arrived in to see what had happened. And in Genesis chapter 3, we can find out basically what God said when he had discovered that they had basically violated his commandment. And he said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree from which I commanded you not to eat? So it's interesting that even in that instance, they were already covering up by putting something over their body. He knew that they were not in pure situation anymore, because now they viewed something that was pure, their nakedness, now as something to be ashamed of, a sham. So it's interesting that was the beginning of the sin. They ate from a tree they were commanded not to, which contained both good and evil. We've already done a video previous that showed that on a T ledger in accounting, an accounting title ledger, that would separate the debt from the credit, the good from the evil. And so we know there must be a reason why Scripture in Acts, and we're going to read in the book of Acts, chapter 10, verse 39, and it says, and we are witnesses of all things which he did, speaking of Christ, in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Why all of a sudden is the reference there saying that he was hung on a tree? Well, there's a good reason for it. We know later in Scripture it says that cursed is anyone hung on a tree. Well, it's because it's representing where sin began on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so therefore, it's interesting that the symbol that Christ died on has been discovered by most very, very good researched theologians to be more likely the capital T than the lowercase t that has been very much promoted through Christianity today as a symbol of the device that Christ was executed on. It's to hide, really, the ledger, because the T ledger that's used in accounting for credit and debit is the capital T, which represents, of course, title. And the Romans, of course, had to execute someone with title. And they were trying to refer to Christ as being someone in their world, though they know he wasn't, because he certainly made it clear that his kingdom was not of that world. And therefore, his disciples would have fought like other leaders or kings, would have had followers come in and defend him physically. But he was not running a kingdom from the earthly source. His kingdom was heavenly, and he was the Prince of Peace. So we clearly can see now why the Scripture said hung on a tree, because it's a very interesting translation when most people, of course, they would say, why wasn't he hung on a cross? Why didn't they make reference in that way? It was to make us clearly to understand the Genesis Scripture, so we'd understand where sin began and where it all came about and why Jesus was executed on that. to cancel that debt, that sin of good and evil.